Now, I've actually lost track of time. How long do I have? Can I talk for 10 more minutes? Okay, super. Okay. 11 minutes, okay. I'll try to squeeze something else in there. So that's the idea that expectations about about the good for which one is striving, ultimately becoming triumphant. In thinking of what, can think of this as a factor that might nudge people along so that they're more likely to do what they have an obligation to do. It's complicated to think of this. There are a lot of aspects to it. It might be, for example, that you see your own actions as affirmations of the possibility of this kind of state. Or you might see your efforts as down payments, kind of partial contributions to it. Or the idea might be that you think that your efforts are not wasted, cannot be wasted, because they are congruent with something that will obtain in the future. Now, I want to move on from this to a related notion, but a distinct notion. And this is the notion that I want to refer to as the notion of depth. Setting environmental issues aside for a moment, let's imagine that you're concerned about an entirely human sort of problem, a human sort of moral problem. Let's imagine that it's an injustice of some sort, maybe a case of slavery, for example. In any case, there's a disadvantaged and mistreated group of some sort, and you, all on your own, develop a way of thinking about this. You recognize the injustice. It dawns on you that something is seriously amiss here. You feel for the victims of this injustice. You come to care. But in the circumstances in which you live, you feel isolated because others do not see what you see. They don't get it. When you talk to them, you don't get anywhere. The heads nod, but the eyes are glazed. And it's hard for you to see how others can be so insensitive. You're fumbling with your own thoughts, and in a halting and unsure way, you are developing your own vocabulary to try to express those thoughts. It seems to you that you're on your own, a voice calling in the ethical wilderness. But then you discover that there are actually others who feel the same way. Indeed, there are entire like-minded groups, and you associate yourself with a group of like-minded people who support each other. This provides reinforcement. You're no longer isolated. Now you don't have to carry alone the burden of thinking everything through, of thinking out what's wrong with the situation and what should be done to address it. You can make use of the ways of thinking of others. You can take on some of their terminology, and so on. But now, what if the news is even better than this? What if there's a larger reality of some sort, a God, or an impersonal absolute, or a force, or a reality of some sort, that you believe to be on your side in opposing this injustice? This is the idea of reality being deeply morally positive in some way or other. Now, to be entirely clear about this, in my remarks here, I'm neither assuming nor arguing that this is how things are, that morality, that there is this deep dimension to morality. One of my main points, though, is that with respect to matters of moral significance, it matters a lot whether or not there is such a reality. Now, my remarks here in this part are partly inspired by an essay by George Mavrodes, a philosopher retired now at the University of Michigan. Mavrodes' main point, actually, was that if there's a reality that's external to us, that's congruent with reality, with morality, then our having moral obligations is less odd, less absurd. In fact, he said that unless there's a reality independent of us that's supportive of, or something akin to supportive of morality, there's something absurd about our having moral obligations at all. Now, I don't buy this for reasons that you may have picked up on already, and that's just the fact that, as I see it, the need to remove a terrible injustice and the beneficial consequences of doing so seem to me to provide as good a grounding for an obligation to remove that injustice as anything else could. And so on. Yet, I think I'm interested in this idea of depth to moral obligations or moral values, and I want to pursue that. And I should say that this doesn't have anything to do with belief in God as such. That's just one example of how this might work out. And I want to, but however, at the end, I want to come back and say something about belief in God in particular. If we're considering the possibility that morality is deeply embedded in things, we have to ask what's meant by depth here. There are a lot of different possibilities. Consider this remark from this fellow Mavrodes, which is actually which is about Plato, and it does not have to do with a personal deity, but it has to do with moral values being out there in some sense, independent of us. I quote, "Perhaps Plato thought that goodness, or some such thing related to morality, was an ultimate fact about the world. The idea of the good is somehow fundamental to what is as well as to what ought to be. A Platonic man, therefore, who sets himself to live in accordance with the good, aligns himself with what is deepest and most basic in existence. Whatever values a Platonic world imposes on a man are values to which the Platonic world is committed through and through." So the idea is that moral values might be deeply embedded in the structure of things. Such moral values, therefore, would not exist only at the human level or at the level of whatever other animals have something like a moral sense. An example of how this would work is provided by the idea of a creator of the universe, of whom moral values are partly definitive. Again, the idea of a law of karma has it that good and bad actions are relevant consequences, and that this is as fixed a fact as the facts that are reported by basic scientific laws, for example. It's how things are. Now, when you fulfill your obligations in a morally deep world, if this is how the world is, you're aligning yourself with an external reality that somehow or other gives expression to the values in accordance with which you're acting. So for this reason, the moral efforts of an individual are very far from being a potentially futile struggle that may be lost in an indifferent universe. On the contrary, the individual who is struggling to fulfill his obligations under these circumstances has backup of a certain sort. There's a vastly greater reality that's out there that's supportive of his fulfilling his obligations, and upon which, in some way or other, it seems to him, he can rely. So the idea is that in some way reality would be, this idea of deep grounding for morality is the idea that reality in some way would be more disposed towards values such as kindness and benevolence than opposed to them or indifferent to them, more disposed to the fulfillment of obligations than to their being ignored, and so on. Now, I want to say something about the implications of thinking in this way, and gosh, I definitely want to say something about the implications for belief in a God. Caution. I think that any confidence that's predicated on belief in or faith in a morally deep reality, if it's to be reasonable, has to be nuanced and constrained. Why so? There's the obvious fact that life is full of tragedy and so on. That's one thing. But for example, to bring us closer to the issues that we're dealing with here, it seems to me it would be foolish in the extreme to argue that if morality has this kind of deep grip on reality, then we don't need to worry about global warming or the global loss of biodiversity. This would be foolish for the obvious reason that most of the species that have lived on the planet, 99.9% by the sort of figures I've seen, have already met their demise in a series of massive kill-offs. If morality being deeply embedded in this way hasn't stopped any of these earlier massive kill-offs, why would it do so in the unique case in which one species is responsible for wiping out others on a large scale, which is what we have at the moment? Perhaps, too, people who think that morality has this sort of grip on reality might be too optimistic and hence likely to be insufficiently concerned about our current developing disasters, since they believe that fundamentally in some way all is well and all will be well no matter what happens. On the other hand, though, things could go in the other direction, or another direction, and that is that someone who sees her efforts as consistent with reality in some way might be galvanized by this belief into activity, lifted out of what would otherwise be crippling pessimism and hopelessness about the situation, and provided with a basis for thinking that our individual actions are worthwhile. This may in turn motivate and coexist with a determined effort to ensure that all will be well, even here and now, and to set out to be yourself the very mechanism that will ensure that this will be so. So there are a lot of complications here. Really, I'm not prepared to be dogmatic about the best way to approach these issues, and I'm really prepared to leave a lot of this as discussion for further inquiry, subject for further inquiry. I mean, I do think that the idea that the values that you're acting in accordance with, the obligations that you're endeavoring to fulfill, the idea that there's a conduciveness to fulfilling them out there, independent of you, is a powerful factor, and it's a dividing line in a way between those who do take a religious perspective, broadly speaking, and those who don't, and I think it's a matter of no minor significance.